thank you for coming. And I'm really pleased tonight to welcome Tamar Pollard, who's our guest tonight. We're delighted you can be with us. We had hoped you'd be with us in person just before Easter. Unfortunately, obviously, we had to cancel that, but thank you for joining us by Zoom. And you're currently in my hometown of Bedford. Can you just tell folks what you do in Bedford?
Yeah, so I've been based in Bedford for almost 2 years, and I'm the lead for families, children and youth ministry in a church just outside of Bedford in a place called Kempston.
Fantastic. Now, I grew up in Bedford, so Bedford doesn't really have an accent, but you've got a little bit of a twang, not from Bedford. Where are you from originally?
Yeah, sadly, this twang is fading, and I think any Yorkshire friends will say I'm a traitor. I grew up in West Yorkshire, born and bred Yorkshire woman, very proud of that heritage, but have lived all over over the last few years.
Fantastic. And today is Father's Day,
Yeah.
and your story that you're going to share tonight with us really begins with, well, it's your mum and dad, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about about their background and where the story starts.
Yeah, so Dad was a Yorkshireman as well, and Mum, a proud Kiwi. They met in the 60s. Mum had read Enid Blyton as a child and thought that England was all cobble street and thatched cottages, and sort of resolved in her heart, as soon as she had qualified as a teacher and taught for a couple of years, she'd come over to England. She did that and ended up teaching in the same school as my dad in Ilkley in West Yorkshire. And nothing triggered. There's no spark of love at that point, but she returned to New Zealand, and over a couple of years they corresponded, and something must have changed at some point. And she returned, they married, and then in time, 3 other kids came along. So yeah, born and bred in Yorkshire, and all the delights that goes with that, the hills, which I miss in Bedford, rugby league, which is a great sport despite what people south of the M62 think, cricket and many other features.
Fantastic. And they and later you had some pretty unique summer holidays. Can you tell us about what some of your summer holidays look like?
Yeah, so before we were born, Mum and Dad were on a youth hosteling trip with some colleagues in what was Czechoslovakia. They were staying in Prague in 1968 and were awoken one morning to the news that the Russians had invaded. I guess later it was titled as Prague Spring, and the Russians had come in to sort of suppress the freedom and liberalism that was coming up. And so Mum and Dad witnessed firsthand flags being burnt, tanks trampling over people, and just the horror and oppression of communist rule. And actually that morning, as they woke up, my dad was reading in the Bible, if you see your brother in need and don't help him, then how can you say you love God? And Dad couldn't get the images or what he read out of his mind, and just kept mulling it over. And then a few weeks later, they were at a friend's house and happened to meet a friend of a friend, a Dutchman called Andrew. And they were sharing their experiences from their time in Prague. And Andrew was already going into communist Eastern Europe, smuggling in Bibles and other aid. And as he chatted with my parents, he just said, look, you're both teachers. You've both got ridiculously long holidays. And I can say that because I used to be a teacher. You've got ridiculously long holidays. Why don't you use them to help those people you've seen in need? And so really that was the start of my family's long ties with Eastern Europe. Mum and Dad used to pack up every summer holiday, sometimes Christmas and Easter as well, and go behind the Iron Curtain, delivering food and medicine and clothing, anything needed. Once we were asked to take a dentist chair, although we didn't, and along with that they took Bibles. And so as a family grew, so we went with them as well.
Fantastic. And can you tell us some of your memories of those trips? On the one hand, it sounds quite exciting, tripping across Europe, but at another level, it sounds quite daunting, quite scary. Can you tell us perhaps some of the highs and lows that you remember?
Yeah, it's funny. If you'd interviewed me as a child on the highs and lows, I would have said there were no highs, which sounds pretty depressing. But I think, as a child, you were packed into a camper van. There was very little room to move for the first 3 or 4 weeks. There was only my brother and sister to speak with, other than my parents, and play with. The kids over in Eastern Europe didn't speak English. I didn't like the food. It was different. The toilets were pretty grim. They were mainly holes in the ground. And then with that came this real sense of fear, I suppose. There were some countries we couldn't speak in the street because if we spoke in the street, that would draw attention to us being Westerners, and it could draw attention to those we were delivering aid to, as well as a sense of fear. There's a real sense of poverty at sites that I wasn't used to in West Yorkshire, of queues for bread and empty shop shelves and soldiers marching and watchtowers. And so I think, although I didn't get how dangerous it was a lot of the time, it certainly wasn't something I look forward to, especially as my friends were all doing package holidays to Spain and were able to bring back nice little presents for everyone in my class. And I couldn't. I had just been for 6 weeks moving place to place. So that was probably that yeah, as I say, they're probably the lows. But that was when, in the moment, I think, actually, as I got older, so the Romanian Revolution was on my 13th birthday. And it really, I guess growing in maturity as well, it really opened my eyes at that time to why my parents were sacrificing their money and their time, their holidays each year. And I think I became increasingly grateful as a teenager that we were making a difference to people's lives, that we were able to not just give them much needed physical items, but we were able to share a message of hope with them, a message about God's love for them and the difference Jesus can make in our lives. So I think as I grew with age, I probably looked back more fondly on it than I did in the early years.
Thank you. And was there a time you obviously were aware that your parents were Christians? They were doing this because of their Christian faith. Was there a time when you remember coming to faith yourself, when you made that faith your own?
Yeah. So Mum and Dad prayed from us from a very early age, took us along to church right from the get-go, and I guess talked through why we were doing what they were doing as well. So saw their faith lived out day by day in lots of little ways and some massive ways. And it was actually when I was 6 that I first began to realise that it wasn't enough that Mum and Dad believed in Jesus. I knew I'd done wrong. I had a vicious temper. I was prone to lying. So I knew there's lots of things that I'd done that had angered God and upset God. And I couldn't rely on my parents to save me. I needed to ask Jesus, who died on the cross, to forgive me for the wrong I'd done and to become my friend and saviour. And so that was a sort of quite significant turning point, age 6. And then I guess as I went through my teenage years, actually a month before the Romanian Revolution, around the time of the Berlin Wall coming down, was another sort of pivotal moment where I began to think, well, if I believe all this, then really it should be impacting the way I live. It should be impacting my decisions. It should be impacting my speech. It should be impacting how I look forward at things. And so again, about 5 weeks before my 13th birthday, just almost went spoke to God and sort of said, look, I don't just want you to be, Jesus to be my friend, but I want you to be number one in my life. I really want to live for you and tell others about you. And I think really they were two big points, but actually threaded through those in between 6 and almost 13 was just a building confidence, a building realization of who God is and how he is at work in the big things and in the small things in life. And Eastern Europe was really significant in that, in developing my understanding and my faith. As I saw, I guess, unusual, surprising, miraculous things happen. I could share a couple of those if you like.
Go on then. I seem to remember you talking about some involve hostage taking and medical trips to the hospital. Tell us about some of those miracles that you saw.
Yeah, so the first one, when I was about 7, we were in what was Yugoslavia, is now Kosovo, and we had friends. He was a leader of a church, and he was in desperate need of medical help from the hospital. He was in a small town and he needed to get to the city. But the communist council, the leaders of the town, would not allow him, would not give him a travel pass to go to the hospital because he led a church. And we were staying there, and I guess Mum and Dad realised the seriousness of his condition and decided that they had to take him to the city, to the hospital the next day. And so the next day off we set, but not just with him, but also his wife and his 4 children, because they didn't want to leave his wife vulnerable with 4 young children to care for. So off we all set, crammed into the camper van, and we were on the road to the hospital when a police car flagged us over to stop. Now that wasn't unusual. Often we were stopped in those days, and we were asked why we were traveling in those parts. They weren't used to seeing Westerners, and they'd often look for, was there something wrong with the car so they can fine us something. Anyway, they stopped us and they asked for our passports. They looked at my mum's, and then all of us children were traveling on my dad's, so they sort of checked us off one by one. But they climbed into the camper van to do so. And obviously in the back of the camper van was this leader of the church who was very poorly, and his wife and their children. And he walked past them one by one by one and didn't see any of them. All 6 of them almost disappeared to him before his own eyes. And I remember Dad explaining to us afterwards, reminding us how Jesus, when he walked on earth, made blind eyes see, and how God in that moment had done the opposite, how he'd made seeing eyes blind. And that's pretty big when you see that when you're 7. And then a year later, when I was 8, we were going from Hungary to Romania. And we're on a border. Borders were always the most tense moments. You never quite knew how long you'd be queuing. You didn't quite know how you'd be treated. You never were sure what they would find. And as soon as we pulled up at this border and a guard came, she asked, have you got any Bibles? It was her very first question. We later discovered they were waiting for us. They had wanted posters of my family around the country's borders. But she asked if we had any Bibles, and we showed our own. But then as she searched and her colleagues searched the van, they found a number of Bibles and said that we had to pay a fine. This was 1985, and it was over £3,500. So we're talking tens of thousands now. We obviously didn't have that money. And so that was the point where they decided to keep my mum and the camper van hostage, and they decided to march my dad and my brother, who was 6, my sister who was 12, and myself, who was 8, with Kalashnikovs pointed like on our backs. So we had the gun barrels touching our backs, and we were marched back to Hungary and told not to return till we could get the money. So which we then had to obviously find somewhere to go. We walked to the nearest town. We got a bus to our closest friends, and Dad spent the next 2 days on the phone trying to get the money from the bank. 1985 computer systems were pretty basic, but amazingly Mum and Dad had left their bank books there to be updated, and so the bank were able to have an emergency meeting on the Saturday, and Dad had taught a couple of the colleagues' children, and so they were able to be sort of guarantors for the loan. And so the money came through, and we were able to buy my mum back, buy the camper van back. We were banned from Romania, but Mum and Dad were, I just remember them at the time talking to us children and saying, look, you can tell people that we got into trouble, because they'll know we've changed our itinerary when we get back, but you mustn't tell people what we paid. God is our provider, and he will find a way for us to pay back that loan. And at the time, I suppose you're 8 and I didn't really understand loans. But I saw a quiet confidence in them that God had got it, that he would take care of us. And over the next 6 months, there would be every now and then an envelope shoved through the letterbox with notes of money in, or a check would arrive through the post. And 6 months to the date, all the money we had been fined had come in for anonymous gifts and donations. And again, it was that realization as an 8-year-old, look, God isn't just majestic and powerful and the one who's overall in charge, but he's interested in me and my family. And so that's why I say, really, although there were pivotal moments of faith, it really is a journey of growing and understanding of who God is and how he cares for us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing those stories of God miraculously working just through some ordinary situations like money as well. Thank you. Now, you've given a glimpse into what life is like, that the trips aren't easy, that problems arise. Can you tell us about the last trip that your mum and dad made?
Yeah, so as we sort of grew older, as long as we were, once we were in sixth form, as long as we were putting our summer to good use, we were allowed not to go on the trips. But Mum and Dad continued, even though the Iron Curtain had fallen. There was still great poverty in Central and Eastern Europe. There was still a need of resources for those working in churches. And so Mum and Dad kept on going. And in 97, they were again going from, they'd gone through Slovakia and were traveling sort of through the top northeast bit of Hungary onto Romania. And as they were driving, the lights on their camper van failed. It was nighttime. The roads were unlit and unsurfaced. And so Mum and Dad just thought, oh, look, there is no point keeping going anymore tonight. We'll just pull over in a lay-by. We'll stay the night. And then in the morning, we'll pop into the city. We'll get the lights sorted and we'll continue on our way. Now, that's something we did a lot. We always had a plan, but it was a very flexible plan of where we'd go. So it wasn't unusual to stay in a lay-by. But as they slept in a lay-by, a couple of local youths drove past and saw a Western vehicle, and they, I guess, decided it was a chance to make a bit of quick cash. And so they banged on the door. I woke my parents and said, spoke to them in Hungarian, but basically said my parents were illegally parked and they had to pay a fine. Now, unlike the one 12 years before that, this wasn't an expensive fine. It was only about £14, the equivalent of £14. And whilst Mum and Dad didn't believe they were police, they also thought, well, it's not that much. And it's probably easier just to pay it. And then when we go into the town in the morning to get the lights fixed, we'll also mention to the police that there's maybe a gang operating, there's some troublemakers on the road. And so they paid the fine. The guys gave them a kind of receipt, and off the lads went. Mum and dad settled back down for the night. But that wasn't the end. I guess the lads had seen in to the camper van. It was only 10 days into the trip, so it would have been absolutely loaded up still with things to give away. And so as mum and dad slept, they were woken a second time. And dad was like, I've had enough of this. He looked out the window, saw it was the guys, and climbed into the cab of the camper van to drive off. But as he climbed in and started the ignition, one of the lads was armed with an iron bar. And so he smashed through the window and began beating my dad, and beat him so much that dad had multiple heart attacks and suffocated on his blood. The teenagers fled the scene. The youths fled the scene. And my mum tried to resuscitate dad, but she couldn't. She couldn't move the camper van. My dad was a dead weight in the driver's seat. There was nowhere to go. But mum talked about knowing a tremendous peace at that time. She knew the lads would return, but there was nothing she could do. And so she got dressed and she hid her wedding ring and passports and money and the receipt the lads had given. She hid it all away and then just planted a little bit of money in her purse by the door and waited, reading her Bible, praying, desperately trying to seek comfort from God, but waiting. And sure enough, the lads did return. They needed to finish what they had begun, I suppose. Mum had seen their faces and they needed to get rid of the evidence. And so they came back to kill her. And they thought they had, but they didn't. They strangled her and they knocked her unconscious, but they didn't end her life.
Tamar, where were you when you heard this news? Because you weren't on this trip with them. How did you hear about this?
Yeah, so it happened sort of on a Monday night, early hours of a Tuesday morning. I found out on the Wednesday lunchtime. So my mum was found on a Tuesday morning. She was taken to hospital in a pretty awful way, actually. She was in intensive care for a little bit. And gradually they managed to extract the information about her, who she was, because she had hidden my passport so well. And then I guess it was over to the Foreign Office to try and locate family. My sister was found first. And she was at work and she had the news broken to her. My brother was in the family home. He was woken up by the Daily Mail, actually, who were ringing, asking for a comment. But amazingly, the police rang the door as the Daily Mail started to speak. And so he had the news broken to him by a policeman who happened to be a family friend as well. But I was doing some children's work down on a beach in Kent in a place called Broadstairs. And I was playing crazy golf with teenagers, oblivious to what had happened 36 hours before, until I got called and told I had to return to where we were staying. I was working with a team of people on the beach. I got called back. We were staying in a church and called into a study. I had no idea what I was doing. As I walked up the street, I was like, what have I done wrong? Am I going to be told off? I've only been playing crazy golf. But as I walked into this study in a church, there was a policeman waiting for me. And he took off his helmet and I was like, I really don't think I've done anything that bad. And And then he started to tell me what had happened, but he only started to tell me about what had happened to mum. And so all the time he was talking about my mum, and she'd been found, and what treatment she was receiving, and her injuries. I just kept in my head going, Dad's dead, Dad's dead, Dad's dead. And it was weird. It was almost like I was detached. I felt like I was watching over the room, watching on, seeing it, the news unfold. And I knew it was about me, but it was so surreal and impossible to process. And sure enough, he went on to tell me that my dad had been killed, and that we needed to get out there to be with my mum as soon as possible.
And you make it out, and you find your mum in hospital. Can you tell us about that time in hospital?
Yeah, so Andrew and Rebecca flew down from Yorkshire down to Heathrow, and we were able to fly out together. So we arrived in Budapest on the Wednesday night. But then it was too late to go to where my mum was. She was about 4 hours away from there. And so we were taken by the British Embassy the next morning, travelled up to Nyíregyháza, where mum was in hospital. And as we travelled, they gave the news to us that they'd just caught the lads, so 3 of them, an 18-year-old and 2 22-year-olds. And they'd caught them because the receipt they'd given my parents happened to be one of their speeding tickets. So when they found mum's passport, they were able to locate the lads as well. So that's sort of the context we're going into. We're driving in 2.5 days after the attack had happened, knowing that the lads had been caught. But I don't really think the penny had dropped. Still, I'd seen it as we flew out. I'd seen it on the London Evening Standard. It was front page on our complimentary paper. So I'd read it. I'd been told it. I'd discussed it with my brother and sister. I'd heard they'd been caught, but I don't think anything could have prepared me for that. The moment I walked in and saw mum, she looked so not like my mum. She looked, I've never seen a face so battered and bruised, and hand marks on her neck. But it wasn't just the sight that sort of hit me as I walked in, but also the way she was speaking. Her jaw needed wiring, it hadn't been, so her voice sounded strange. She looked strange. And then what she was saying was, I guess, more explicit details than I've just given of everything that had happened. And so there with the emotions, just like if a penny hadn't dropped at that point, before that point, it came crashing down. And just pure hatred really was flowing through my veins. I wanted to see the lads. I wanted to lay into the lads. I wanted to hurt them. I probably even wanted to kill them. I was so angry at that moment that they could do that to my dad, who was such a gentle guy. He was far from perfect, but he was gentle and compassionate and other-centered, and they killed him. And my mum, though, didn't just give the details of what had happened, but she went on to say, I don't bear any malice against them. I forgive them. And then she said, if there's any Christians watching this, because it was being broadcast live on Yorkshire television at the time, she's like, if there's any Christians watching, can you pray that they don't just know my forgiveness, but they know God's forgiveness as well. I thought I had been angry before, but then I was absolutely fuming that mum could say that when they thought they'd killed her. She had been brutally beaten as well, and she'd witnessed dad killed in front of her. And I was so angry. I did the grown up thing of that a 20-year-old does, and I stormed out of the hospital room. Mum had a balcony on her room, and it was like a toddler temper tantrum, just stomping out, slamming the door, and then gripping the rail, and just raging. Like, my emotions were just exploding. I was in turmoil. How could she say that? How could God allow that? How could they get away with it? All those different things. Shall I go on?
But let me just come in briefly and say, you talked earlier about seeing God at work doing quite incredible miracles, and at that point we get faith. That makes sense. Trusting in a God who does miracles for you, that makes perfect sense. What place is there for faith when you just lost your dad and your mum's there in hospital bed?
Yeah, so well, I think that was my question right there and then. Maybe not quite that wording, but I remember just standing there raging and then just going, do I believe? Like, do I believe? Because Mum had said about praying for God's forgiveness. I was like, do I believe in God? Like, how can God allow that to happen? Do I believe that God is real? And I remember that's like a question I started with, a question that probably many of us have been asked at times. And I just thought back. I thought back over some of those examples I've given you and many more, how I had seen God really at work. I believed it to be true not only from my own experience, but from what I'd read again and again in the Bible and how it matched up. I believed it from what other people had told me. I believed it through my conscience, knowing what is right and wrong. I could not deny that God is real. So then I was left asking, well, if I think God is real, do I believe God is good? And again, sort of asked, ran back, well, why have I believed that up to this point? So I was 20 at the time. So over the last 20 years, why have I believed God is good? And again, own experience, other experiences, the Bible, the goodness of creation. I could not deny there was someone who had put our world into existence and had provided just the right amount of light and just the right amount of oxygen. And I couldn't deny either that Jesus had lived and walked on earth and done incredible things and died a horrific death and risen again. I was studying history at the time at uni, and I guess I've been more and more convinced as I looked into things more and more of the historical evidence for the person of Jesus. But he was more than just a special man or a good teacher, that he was God. And so I found myself going, well, yeah, I believe that God is real. I believe that God is good. And I believe that Jesus came because God is good. And Jesus died as the only good one ever to live, the only perfect person. And he died and he rose again so that I can be forgiven. It was quick, as in it was whilst I was on the balcony, but it was over, I don't know, no one came looking for me, so maybe not that long, but about half an hour, asking those questions, working it through, thinking it through, talking to myself, and then going, okay, well, what do I do with that? And I knew that God had forgiven me, and he asks us to forgive others. And I can just remember on the balcony just going, God, that's too hard. I can't do that. If you want me to forgive, then you have to do it. You have to change this hatred to love, this anger to peace, this want for revenge for forgiveness. I cannot do it. It's not in my capabilities. And for whatever reason, in that moment, God answered the prayer like that. I felt completely different straight away. It didn't mean I wasn't sad. It didn't mean I had confused, but I did know a peace. The hatred had gone. And I was able to go back in and chat to Mum and say, I'm with you on this. I forgive them too.
Amazing. Can you just wind the clock forward a little bit for us, and tell us about what happened to your mum? Did she recover? And can you tell us about the attackers as well? What happens to them?
Yeah, well, in a way, Mum recovered, but I would say not fully, not ever. She obviously had physical wounds, so she was left with plates in her jaw. She was left with a blood clot on her brain. About a year after the attack, she started struggling with post-traumatic stress syndrome. I moved back a year after from university after graduating, and would waken in the night to her screaming and having flashbacks. And at some point, from having post-traumatic stress, her memory started going. At first we put it down to that, but actually she was diagnosed 3 years after Dad was killed with early onset Alzheimer's, which she had for 8 years before she died. So not a full recovery. It didn't stop her going to Eastern Europe though. She went back on further trips with other groups, still delivering aid, still taking in Bibles, still wanted to show and speak of God's love. And not just trips to friends from her past, but also trips to the guys who were in prison. At their trial, she gave each of them a care package. It included things like toiletries and writing paper and biscuits, but also a Bible. And she asked if she could stay in touch with them. And 2 of the 3 said yes. And so my mum wrote back and forth. On the first anniversary, she visited the mayor in the town when my dad was killed, put up a memorial in the lay-by Dad was killed in, as a sort of thank you to all that Mum and Dad had done for almost 30 years in Eastern Europe. And so she went back for the unveiling of that, but also visited the 2 of the lads in prison. And she went back a further time, at least once, I think maybe twice, but definitely once with Channel 4. So she kept in touch for a while. Obviously, as her Alzheimer's kicked in, that contact faded somewhat. But in the early stages of Alzheimer's, we received a letter from Istvan. Istvan was the 18-year-old who had the iron bar. He was the one who actually killed my dad. And we got a letter from Istvan, and it was titled, I caused death, but through it, I found life. And he wrote about how he just couldn't get out of his head how this lady had said she'd forgiven him when he had killed her husband and tried to kill her. And so he decided he had to read the Bible. And as he read the Bible, he became convinced of the claims of Jesus. He became convinced that, like I was, that Jesus was a real man, that he was God's son, that he had died to take the punishment for the wrong things we'd done, and he'd risen again so we can have a sure and certain hope of a future with Christ. And so he'd become a Christian, just like Mum had asked on that hospital bed all those years before for people to pray. He'd come to share the same hope that I and my parents shared.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that amazing story. In a moment, I'm going to open this up for other people to ask some questions. I've got a few more questions to ask, and I'll ask another one just in a minute. But if you'd like to ask a question, if you're on Zoom, there's a little chat feature at the bottom. You can press the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and you can type a message in on the right-hand side. If you're watching on YouTube, you can add a little comment. There's a little comments box next to the video. There's 53 people watching. Welcome if you're on YouTube. You can type a little comment in the box, and we'll pass your question on. So just as you might be thinking about that now, do type in. You don't have to ask a question, but it's open there if you'd like. And just before, while people might be thinking of questions, Tamar, can you tell us, did you ever go back yourself?
Yeah, it took me a long time. I think I always wanted to go back. I found it quite hard actually when Eastern Europe became a bit of cheap holiday destination for people. I think in my mind it felt wrong to just go back as a tourist. Not for other people, but for me, because of all that I had witnessed and experienced. And so I was keen to go back, but I didn't know when. I didn't know what capacity. And I guess I just chose to spend my annual leave doing other things as well. But in 2017, so three summers ago, it was the 20th anniversary. And I decided I wanted to go back. I spent quite a bit of time trying to locate the lads. They will be out of prison now. But it's hard knowing where to start. We'd lost contact with most of our connections over the years through Mum's decline and death. And it turns out also that their names are quite common names when you type them into social media, and you can't really send someone a message saying, by the way, are you the one who killed my dad? So I gave up on trying to see them, although I'm still hopeful one day I will meet them and I'll hear what they're doing with their lives. But I was still keen to return to Hungary to see that memorial. The problem was I didn't know where it was exactly. Mum and Dad, well, I suppose sat-navs didn't exist really in those days, and they never exactly went the typical route, partly to throw people off our scent, the police off our scent. So I kind of knew it was near Chaza, because that's where Mum had been in hospital. I knew what direction they were travelling in, but that was it. And then after watching a film called Lion, where an Indian lad managed to locate his family through Google Earth, I was inspired to locate the memorial through Google Earth and spent a week on the internet searching, found the memorial, dropped a pin. And so on the 4th of August 2017, I went back for longer than that, but I went to the memorial, read Dad's favourite psalm, sang the song that Mum had sang as a solo at Dad's funeral, and just had a time of looking back and giving thanks to God for his faithfulness to me, and thanks for two great parents who lived out what they said they believed. So yeah, I did go back then, and hopefully I'll go back again. Something I love about Bedford is there are lots and lots of different nationalities all around, and I love using my token phrases of Polish and Romanian with some of the kids who come along to groups. But yeah, I'd love to return maybe to some of the other countries and improve my language as well.
Fantastic. I don't know if it's true. I might have made this up, but I have a feeling that Bedford has the largest Polish population outside of Poland, or it used to anyway, some stat like that.
There you go. So yeah.
There we go. Interesting fact. Now, I've not seen any questions come up on the Zoom or on the YouTube, and that's absolutely okay, because people are watching along, and that's great. And I do have, I've got a couple more questions just to ask you, just as we close, and then I'll close after that. But just two final questions, and the first one is this really, and you've covered it to some extent, but let me just ask it again. And that your story isn't one of an amazing miracle of rescue. Your dad gets killed and your mum never fully recovers, but the miracle is one of finding the power to forgive some great evil that's been committed against your family, and finding the power to forgive. Can you just tell us, remind us, where does that power come from?
Well, you know, there's a couple of my mum's friends watching, and Dad's friends. My parents weren't anything special. I mean, you know, they're special to me, but they were so ordinary. A little bit eccentric maybe, but only I can say that, no one else is allowed to. So Mum wasn't this superstar, and I am very ordinary too. so then you have to look, where does it come from? Well, I think it comes from the fact that we have been forgiven by Jesus. I was 6, as I touched on earlier, when I asked God to forgive me for the wrong things I'd done. I don't deserve that forgiveness. I've done plenty wrong in the however many years since, 37 years since. My mum was 14 when she came to experience God's forgiveness for herself, and Dad was older. Dad was 30 actually. So I think the reason we're able to forgive is because God has shown incredible undeserved forgiveness to us, firstly, and then he enables us to forgive. So he doesn't ask us to do it in our own strength, to magic up this soppy love or I'll try harder attitude. He goes, come to me. And I went to him pretty broken that day on the balcony, and he enabled me. And there's plenty of times since where I've been hurt, I've been damaged, I've been let down, and I've struggled to forgive. And it's not happened as instantly. And often it's not happened as instantly because I've wanted to hold on to a grudge. I've sort of dwelt on it and become bitter. I've wanted to be vindicated and proven right. But every time I have got to the stage where I've kind of gone, God, I can't do this. I need you to enable me to forgive. He has. So it might not be as dramatically as on the balcony in Hungary, but because I've been forgiven, so God enables me to forgive others. And that was the same for Mum.
Thank you, Tamar. I've got a final question, really, and it's this. I was reading a newspaper article about the events, and there's a comment from, I think it's one of your family's neighbours, and they said to the news reporter of your mum, I don't know how she will face the future. And that's an understandable comment to make. And there may be situations as well in our own lives where something major happens. We're all in the midst of a major event at the moment, and we might think to ourselves, how on earth am I going to face the future now? Now this big change has happened. Can you just tell us how you face the future? What gives you confidence to keep going now? What gave you the confidence to keep going then?
Yeah, I think, there's lots of little things, aren't there? Well, they're not little, they're significant. People who walk with you, who listen to you sob, who put an arm around you, who pray for you, who encourage you, so you're not alone humanly. But I think really 3 other huge things. I think remembering that we've a God who cares, and he wants us to cry out to him. It's not that we just talk to him when we feel sorted and life is going well. The bit of the Bible Mum was reading after Dad had died was the book of Psalms, found right in the middle of the Bible. And it's full of cries of lament, of raging, how long, God? This doesn't make sense. And I think that is really freeing to know I can go to God and go, this hurts, and I don't get why you're allowing it all. There's some aspects of my parents' suffering I will never ever get, and so I think it is being real in those moments. Today I hadn't realised we'd put this on Father's Day. When we arranged the day, it was just when I wasn't doing youth, and I've been pretty anxious about that because 23 years on, I still miss my dad. So I think it's good for me to know I've got a God who cares and loves to hear me. That helps me keep going. I can talk to him. But he doesn't just care, but he knows, because Jesus came and he suffered a life of injustice. He suffered a life of he lived homeless for a number of years at least. He suffered betrayal. He suffered physical beatings. He suffered rejection. He suffered lies and accusations. And he went through that for me. So I've got a God who cares, and a God who knows what it is to feel that I do, like I do. And I think those two things kind of fit with the verse that became really precious to me during just after Dad died. And it was a bit in the first early few books of the Bible, in Deuteronomy, at the end of Deuteronomy 29:29. And it talks about how there are secret things of God that we'll never get, but the stuff he reveals about himself enables us to continue. Well, I know that I've got a God who cares, who listens to me, who catches my tears, who promises to be a father to the fatherless. I know I've got a God who understands, who knows what it's like. And more than that, he's a God who promises a future where every tear will be wiped away, where our bodies will be made new. My mum's mind won't be addled. My dad's body won't be beaten. There will be no suffering, no injustice, no crime, no heartache. And I'll be with my Saviour. And so I think the fact I know a God who cares, and a God who knows what it's like, and a God who promises a brilliant future, that keeps me going.
Tamar, thank you so much. Just one final question, because I literally just had a text from someone to say,
Okay.
Can you just say something about justice? Because there's been a great injustice done to your family. How does your faith in God give you hope in justice?
Yeah, so I mean, it was interesting at the time of the trial. Mum and my sister went over for the trial, and I was interviewed by Radio 5 Live, and they were like, "Oh, well, if you forgive them, then why do you think it's fair that they've been sentenced?" And it was right. That is justice. They have had to serve a sentence for what they had done. And God is a God of mercy who shows incredible forgiveness to us. But he is also a God of justice. We know in the future, he promises that whilst every tear will be wiped away for those who trust in him, he also promises he will deal with the injustices of this world. And now, whilst we live in waiting, well, he's a God who cares about the oppressed. He's a God who commands those who follow him to take care of the widow and the orphan. And so, I think it's right. There should be justice. I think if we're trusted in Jesus, should be passionate about justice, should be a voice for the marginalised. And we can trust that one day God will justly judge each and every one.
Tamar, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I haven't had any more questions, but I have had a couple of messages just saying, thank you so much for sharing your story. We're so pleased you could join with us tonight. I'm not sure who's listening in. I can see a few people here on Zoom. I can see a lot more numbers on YouTube. So I don't know where you are and where you're from, but thank you for joining us tonight. And I just want to say three things quickly. Hopefully, if the technology works, this interview will be available on YouTube as a video that you can share. It might be that you've heard Tamar's story tonight and think, I'd love to share that with a friend. Please do that. Please do pass it on. The second thing to say is, perhaps you've heard Tamar's story, and it's brought about lots of questions in your own minds about life and faith and forgiveness. If that's you, please do get in touch. It might be that you're local to Linfield, West Sussex. Do get in touch with us at All Saints. It might be that you're from further away, and do get in touch still. And it might be that we're able to pass you on to someone who lives closer to you. And if that's you, if you're local to All Saints, then please do check out our Sunday services as well. We're doing online services at the moment. They're available on YouTube. Do watch along to find out more about faith in God, hope in Him, and what it means to know forgiveness. Thank you so much for joining, and a really special thank you to Tamar. Thank you so much.